The vast emptiness of space was broken only by the imposing silhouettes of the Vlork warships. They formed an impenetrable barrier around Earth's solar system, their sleek metallic hulls reflecting the distant starlight in cold, emotionless glimmers. 4 standard cycles, approximately 20 Earth years. The Seventh Fleet of the Vlork Empire had maintained this blockade with mechanical precision and unwavering discipline. From the command bridge of the flagship, Iron Sentinel, Supreme Commander Kalen observed the blue-green planet through advanced monitoring systems. His tall, gaunt figure cast a long shadow across the polished floor of the bridge as he stood with his four-finger hands clasped behind his back. The pale gray skin of his face remained impassive, but his amber eyes, with their vertical pupils, narrowed slightly as he processed the data streams. Another intercepted communication from their governing bodies, reported Communications Officer Trell, her voice carrying the distinctive metallic undertone of all Vlork speech. They are still attempting to negotiate through the established channels. Kalen acknowledged with a slight incline of his elongated head. Forwarded to analysis, as usual. There is nothing new they can offer. The daily routine aboard the Iron Sentinel had long since fallen into predictable patterns. The crew performed their duties with machine-like efficiency, monitoring Earth's communications, analyzing data, and occasionally dispatching smaller vessels to neutralize the feeble attempts by humans to breach the blockade. These missions were viewed not as combat operations, but as pest control, necessary maintenance to keep the chaotic primates contained in their celestial reservation. During the officers' meal period, Kalen shared a table with his second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Xyler, a younger and notably more aggressive Vlork whose service record was marked by ruthless efficiency. "I intercepted an interesting report from the Science Division today," Xyler said, his voice low despite the privacy field surrounding their table. "The primates have developed a new propulsion theory that might eventually overcome our gravitational disruptors." Kalen consumed a precisely measured nutrient cube before responding. "Eventually" is the operative term. Their theoretical advances rarely translate to practical applications within a reasonable time frame. But they continue to evolve their thinking at an alarming rate, pressed Xyler. The High Command's decision to merely contain rather than cleanse this system remains controversial. Kalen's eyes flashed with momentary irritation. The official directive is to prevent the uncontrolled expansion of the human species and protect our trade routes and member races from potential contamination. "We follow orders, Lieutenant Commander, not question them." Xyler straightened in deference, but his skepticism remained evident in his posture. "Of course, Supreme Commander." What Kalen did not share, what only he and a select few in the highest echelons of the Empire knew, was the real reason behind the blockade. The Vlork Empire, for all its technological superiority and military might, feared the humans. Not for what they were, but for what they might become. The High Command had analyzed thousands of species across the known galaxy, and none had shown the humans' peculiar combination of adaptability, technological innovation, and unpredictable creativity. In controlled laboratory conditions, human problem-solving approaches repeatedly defied Vlork prediction algorithms. Their erratic leaps of intuition and willingness to discard established paradigms made them dangerously unpredictable. More concerning still were the mysterious energy signatures emanating from the Sol system that Vlork scientists could neither replicate nor fully understand. Whether these originated from some natural phenomenon unique to Earth or from primitive human experiments remained unclear, but the potential applications threatened the very foundations of Vlork technological supremacy. From his private observation deck later that cycle, Kalen watched Earth rotate slowly on the main screen. The night side glittered with the lights of human cities, fewer now than when the blockade began, evidence of the economic stagnation and technological regression the isolation had caused. Occasional flares indicated failed launch attempts, each one crushed more mercilessly than the last to reinforce the message. The sky was closed. Kalen felt no particular satisfaction in this duty. The Vlork did not indulge in emotional responses to strategic necessities. The containment of humanity was simply the most logical solution to a complex problem, at least until the Empire determined whether this strange species represented an opportunity to be harvested or a threat to be eliminated. For now, the blockade held firm, an unyielding metal ring around a world, slowly surrendering to despair. The alert came during the ship's designated rest period, a minor disruption barely deserving of attention. A proximity sensor on the outer defense perimeter had detected movement from the asteroid belt, but the object was so small that the automated systems almost dismissed it as debris. Duty Officer Vex, responsible for the night watch, frowned at the trajectory analysis. "Correction," he muttered to himself. "This is not random debris." He enhanced the image, revealing a tiny spacecraft of undeniably human design. Its outdated propulsion system emitted minimal energy, and its hull showed no weapon signatures whatsoever. More puzzling still, it was broadcasting a signal, a repeating pattern using an archaic Vlork dialect that predated the Empire itself. Vex hesitated only briefly before activating the commander's private communication channel. Protocol demanded reporting any anomalous human activity, regardless of apparent threat level. Supreme Commander Kalen arrived on the bridge precisely 7 minutes later, fully uniformed despite the interruption to his rest cycle. Lieutenant Commander Zyler followed close behind, his expression tense with anticipation. "Report," Kalen ordered crisply. Vex displayed the trajectory and signal analysis on the main screen. "Human vessel, minimal capabilities, broadcasting this message repeatedly. Translation software identifies it as a request for direct negotiation, expressed in classic High Vlorkian, a dialect not used in standard communications for at least 12 generations." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread across the bridge before Kalen's sharp glance silenced them. "This is either supreme arrogance or complete madness," Zyler said, his lip curling in disdain. "They send this antique against our fleet, with no defenses? Their desperation has finally driven them to suicide missions," offered strategic analyst Mrev from her station. "Perhaps they hope to study our response patterns." Zyler stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "We should destroy it immediately as a warning. The protocol for unauthorized approach is quite clear." Kalen remained silent, his gaze fixed on the small craft, now visible as a tiny speck against the backdrop of stars. Something about this situation triggered his inherent caution. The Vlork had not survived and thrived across the galaxy by responding predictably to the unexpected. "How?" he finally asked. "Would humans know classic High Vlorkian? That dialect isn't even taught to most of our own population anymore, except to scholars and the highest noble families." The bridge fell silent as the implications settled upon them. The human vessel continued its steady approach, now close enough that its outdated design was clearly visible on the magnified display. "Target their propulsion system," Kalen ordered after a moment of consideration. "Minimal energy, warning shot only." A pale blue beam lanced out from one of the Iron Sentinel's smaller weapons arrays, deliberately missing the human craft by a calculated margin. The standard procedure was clear: a warning shot, followed by communication in Galactic Standard, and then destruction if the approach continued. The tiny ship did not alter course. Instead, it reduced speed and eventually came to a relative stop at a precise distance from the Vlork flagship, close enough to be clearly visible, but just beyond the range of the automated point defense systems. Its position directly aligned with the main shuttle bay entrance of the Iron Sentinel. "They are maintaining broadcast of the same message," Communications Officer Trell reported. "No other transmissions detected." "Like a primitive knocking on our door," muttered Science Officer Zalen, earning a sharp look from Zyler. Kalen studied the small craft, noting its deliberate positioning. This was not random, not desperate, and certainly not suicidal. This was calculated, a move in a game he hadn't realized they were playing. "Initiate full scan for explosives or biological agents," he ordered. "Verify life signs aboard." The results returned quickly. One life form detected. Human. No weapon signatures, No unusual energy readings, no indications of explosive material or biological contaminants, reported Security Chief Mock. 1. Zyler repeated incredulously. They send a single human. Kalen's decision coalesced gradually, forming from a mixture of strategic calculation, curiosity, and an intuition he would never publicly acknowledge. Whatever game this was, he needed to understand the rules and the stakes. Prepare Secure Dock 7 for controlled entry, he ordered, igniting immediate protests. Commander, with respect, Zyler objected forcefully. Allowing any human vessel to dock violates every security protocol established for this blockade. I am well aware of the protocols, Lieutenant Commander, Kalen replied, his tone leaving no room for further argument. Security. Teams at maximum readiness. Full decontamination procedures. Gravitational restraints active. I want this human contained, isolated, and thoroughly examined before any interaction. His amber eyes met Zyler's in silent challenge. Sometimes, Lieutenant Commander, understanding an enemy's desperation reveals more than destroying them in ignorance. The statement was perfectly aligned with Vlork military philosophy, making it difficult for Zyler to continue his objection without appearing insubordinate. He stiffened, then bowed slightly. As you command. Kalen turned back to the view screen, watching as the tiny human ship began its final approach to the designated dock. And Zyler, he added quietly, I want you personally overseeing the security detail. Consider this an opportunity to observe human psychology at its breaking point. The flattery worked as intended. Zyler's posture straightened with pride at the assignment. It will be done with utmost precision, Commander. The massive docking bay of the Iron Sentinel dwarfed the human vessel that now sat at its center, surrounded by heavily armed Vlork soldiers in full battle armor. The temperature in the bay had been deliberately kept low, comfortable for Vlork physiology, but chilling for humans, and the gravity set slightly higher than Earth standard. Small psychological advantages were standard Vlork procedure. Lieutenant Commander Zyler stood at the front of the formation, his sidearm visibly powered and ready. Behind the troops, observation drones hovered silently, recording every detail for later analysis. Open communication channel, Zyler ordered. His voice, translated and amplified, echoed throughout the bay. Human vessel. You have violated sovereign Vlork space. Exit your craft immediately and submit to processing. For several moments, nothing happened. Then, with a hiss of equalizing pressure, the small airlock on the human ship began to cycle. The Vlork soldiers tensed, weapons trained on the opening door. A single figure emerged. Not a military commander, not a young soldier, but an elderly human female. She wore a simple, gray jumpsuit with no insignia or decorations. Her white hair pulled back neatly from a face marked with the lines of age. She carried no visible technology, save for a small translator device at her throat. She stepped onto the deck with remarkable steadiness despite the increased gravity, her eyes calmly surveying the weapons aimed at her before settling on Zyler's imposing figure. I am Dr. Evelyn Reed, she announced in perfectly pronounced classic High Vlorkian, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. Thank you for accepting my request for dialogue. The use of the ancient dialect, spoken with such precise pronunciation, created a momentary ripple of unease among the Vlork soldiers. Even Zyler found himself temporarily speechless before regaining his composure. You will be escorted to a secure holding area for decontamination and interrogation. He finally responded in standard Vlorkian, deliberately avoiding the dialect she had used. Dr. Reed inclined her head in acceptance. Of course, I understand your protocols. She stepped forward with remarkable dignity, seemingly unperturbed by the weapons still trained on her. As she was surrounded by guards and led from the docking bay, Zyler studied her with growing suspicion. The humans had sent their oldest, weakest specimen as an envoy. It made no strategic sense unless this was some form of psychological warfare he didn't yet understand. In the high-security conference room, Dr. Evelyn Reed sat calmly at one end of a long table. The room was deliberately designed to intimidate, sparse, cold, with harsh lighting that emphasized the alien architecture. A transparent barrier separated her from the Vlork side of the room, where Supreme Commander Kalen now entered, followed by Xyler and 2 security officers. Kalen took his time studying the human before activating the communication system. He had reviewed the preliminary scans. This human was indeed advanced in age by their standards, approximately 68 Earth years. Her vital signs showed remarkable steadiness given the circumstances, suggesting either exceptional control or pharmaceutical assistance. "I am Supreme Commander Kalen of the 7th Fleet," he finally stated, speaking in standard Vlorkian rather than responding to her use of the ancient dialect. "Your presence here violates the terms of containment established for your species. Explain your purpose." Dr. Reed smiled slightly, a gesture that the Vlork generally found unsettling due to its ambiguity in their own culture. "Supreme Commander," she replied, continuing in classic High Vlorkian, "I appreciate the extraordinary circumstance of my reception. I represent no official Earth government or military organization. I come as a private citizen with specialized knowledge that may be of mutual benefit." Kalen noted that her pronunciation of his title included the subtle tonal inflections that denoted respect without subservience, a nuance of the ancient dialect that even many modern Vlork would miss. "If Earth's governments did not send you," Xyler interjected sharply, "then you have no authority to negotiate anything." Dr. Reed turned her attention to him, her expression unchanged. "You must be Lieutenant Commander Xyler. Your reputation precedes you, particularly your handling of the Nebula Outpost incident 2 cycles ago. A remarkable tactical display." Xyler stiffened visibly. The Nebula Outpost operation had indeed enhanced his standing within the fleet, but it had never been mentioned in any communication that could have been intercepted by humans. "How could you possibly have knowledge of internal Vlork military operations?" he demanded. "The same way I know that the real reason for this blockade is not what you've officially stated," she replied calmly. "The Vlork Empire fears human unpredictability and adaptability. You fear our potential to develop technologies that might eventually rival or even surpass your own in specific areas. But more immediately, you fear the growing instability within your own ruling structure, the conflict between the traditional hierarchy and the progressive coalition that threatens to fracture the empire from within." The room fell completely silent. Even Kalen could not fully conceal his shock at her words, which referenced political divisions that were carefully hidden from most of the empire's own citizens. "Is this some primitive attempt at psychological manipulation?" Xyler recovered first, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Throwing random speculations in the hope of eliciting confirmatory responses?" "No, Lieutenant Commander," Dr. Reed answered. "It is context for my proposal. I would not waste your time or risk my life for games." She turned her attention back to Kalen. "Commander, I believe you are pragmatic enough to recognize value when presented with it, regardless of its source." Kalen studied her for several silent moments before responding. "Present your proposal, human." Dr. Reed nodded once, appreciatively. "The Vlork Empire is facing a crisis your scientists have been unable to solve, a degenerative genetic condition affecting the ruling caste, caused by centuries of selective breeding combined with radiation exposure unique to core Vlork worlds. The first symptoms appeared 3 generations ago, but the progression has accelerated dramatically in the past cycle." She paused, allowing her words to land with full impact before continuing. "Your geneticists have attempted to develop a retroviral solution, but the complexity of Vlork DNA and the unique nature of the damage have proven resistant to your standard approaches." Kalen kept his expression carefully neutral, though his mind raced. The genetic deterioration affecting the highest echelons of Vlork society was one of the Empire's most closely guarded secrets. The leading families were increasingly unable to produce viable offspring, threatening the very foundation of Vlork hierarchy and governance. Earth scientists have developed novel approaches to genetic repair that operate on fundamentally different principles than Vlork medicine. Dr. Reed continued. "Our adaptability, The very trait that makes you fear us has led to scientific methodologies that your civilization, for all its advancements, simply has not explored. She leaned forward slightly. I propose collaboration. Human genetic expertise to address your biological crisis, in exchange for lifting the blockade and establishing a more equitable relationship between our civilizations. Absurd, Xyler spat immediately. You expect us to believe humans have superior medical technology? When your own species still suffers from countless diseases we eradicated millennia ago. Not superior, Dr. Reed corrected gently. Different. Sometimes a problem requires a perspective so alien to one's own thinking that the solution becomes invisible. That is what we offer, not superior technology, but complementary methodology. Kalen raised a hand to silence Xyler's next outburst. How did you acquire this information about our internal matters? Dr. Reed's expression remained calm, but a hint of sadness touched her eyes. In 20 years of blockade, Commander, do you imagine Earth has been idle? We established a xenological intelligence division specifically to understand the Vlork. We've studied every scrap of information, every communication, every behavioral pattern of your fleet. We've captured and analyzed debris from your smaller vessels. We've intercepted transmissions you believe secure. She sighed softly. But more importantly, we recognize the signs because they match historical patterns from our own past. Powerful civilizations rarely collapse from external pressure. Alone, they fracture from within when faced with existential threats they cannot openly acknowledge. Kalen felt a cold certainty settling in his core. This human was not bluffing. Somehow, impossibly, she knew the truth, or enough of it to be dangerously persuasive. You said you represent no government, he noted carefully. Why should we believe you can deliver this? Scientific assistance. Because I led the team that developed the theoretical framework, she answered simply. I'm not a politician or diplomat. I am a xenoanthropologist and comparative biologist who has dedicated the latter part of my life to understanding the Vlork. The data and preliminary research are contained in my ship's systems, accessible at your discretion. She straightened in her chair. I came alone, Commander, because I needed you to understand this is not a trick or trap. One unarmed human of advanced age presents no conceivable threat to your mighty vessel. I simply offer a choice between pragmatic collaboration and continued adherence to a policy that serves neither of our species' best interests. This is outrageous, Xyler insisted, turning to Kalen. Commander, this is clearly an elaborate deception. The human cannot possibly have the knowledge she claims, nor the authority to implement any agreement. I recommend immediate termination of this interaction and destruction of the human vessel as a warning against further such attempts. Kalen remained silent, weighing options with the calculated precision that had earned him his command. If the human spoke truth, and his instincts increasingly suggested she did, then she offered a potential solution to a crisis that threatened the Empire's very foundation. If she lied, the risk of exploring her proposal further was minimal compared to the potential benefit. Security, escort the lieutenant commander to the bridge, he ordered suddenly. He will oversee our standard operations while I continue this. Unusual dialogue. Xyler stiffened in shock. Commander, protocol requires at least 2 senior officers for any extended interaction with. I am well aware of protocol, Lieutenant Commander, Kalen interrupted coldly. I am invoking Commander's discretion under Statute 7 of the Fleet Directive. You will comply immediately. The security officers moved with practiced efficiency, their posture making it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Xyler shot a venomous glance at the human before straightening his uniform and marching from the room, dignity barely intact. When the door sealed behind them, Kalen deactivated the recording devices with a sequence of commands on his wrist controller, another violation of protocol that would require explanation later, if discovered. Dr. Reed, he said, switching to classic high Vlorkian himself now, you have created a significant complication in my command structure. A necessary one, I suspect, she replied in the same dialect. Lieutenant Commander Zyler represents the traditionalist faction that would prefer humanity's complete subjugation or elimination. He would sabotage any potential cooperation regardless of its merit. Kalen's eyes narrowed. Your understanding of our internal politics is disturbing. Is it not equally disturbing that you've been ordered to contain an entire sentient species based on fear rather than evidence? She countered gently. The Vlork pride themselves on logical pragmatism, yet this blockade represents an emotional response masked as strategic necessity. For the first time in many cycles, Kalen felt genuine uncertainty. The human had penetrated to the core of the contradiction that had increasingly troubled him during his years commanding the blockade. You speak as though you understand the Vlork better than we understand ourselves, he observed, studying her with renewed intensity. Not better, Dr. Reed corrected. Differently, as an outsider with a lifetime of studying comparative civilizations. Sometimes it takes an alien perspective to illuminate one's own cultural blind spots. She hesitated, then added more softly. Just as it took me traveling here alone to demonstrate that humanity is not the monolithic threat your empire portrays us to be. Kalen moved closer to the transparent barrier, examining the fragile human with his keen amber eyes. If, and I emphasize if, your assessment of our internal situation is accurate, what guarantee could you possibly offer that this proposed collaboration wouldn't simply accelerate human technological development to our eventual detriment? None that would satisfy your military protocols, she admitted frankly. I offer only mutual necessity and the observation that continued isolation harms both our peoples. The Vlork genetic crisis worsens while potentially compatible human approaches remain unexplored. Meanwhile, Earth's development stagnates, wasting potential that could benefit the wider galaxy, including the Vlork Empire. She stood up slowly, approaching her side of the barrier until she stood directly opposite Kalen, their significant height difference emphasizing the physical vulnerability that made her journey all the more remarkable. Supreme Commander, I did not come here expecting immediate agreement. I came to plant a seed of possibility, to knock on a door long thought sealed. All I ask is that you consider the evidence I've brought and contemplate whether 20 more years of blockade will better serve the Empire than cautious exploration of an alternative path. For nearly a full standard day cycle, Dr. Evelyn Reed remained in the secure diplomatic quarters of the Iron Sentinel, while Supreme Commander Kalen sequestered himself with the data she had brought. Lieutenant Commander Zyler, ostensibly in charge of standard fleet operations, seethed with suspicion and resentment, monitoring the commander's isolation with growing concern. In his private laboratory space, Kalen worked methodically through the human research materials, cross-referencing them against the classified Vlork genetic data stored in his personal encrypted databases. The correlation was undeniable. The human scientists had indeed identified the fundamental mechanism of the genetic degradation affecting the Vlork elite, and their proposed intervention strategy operated on principles radically different from anything Vlork medical science had attempted. More disturbing still was their accurate assessment of the political ramifications. The genetic crisis was accelerating factional divisions within the Empire, with the most affected noble houses becoming increasingly desperate to maintain their position while concealing their vulnerability. The blockade of Earth had been partly implemented to prevent any possibility of the humans discovering this weakness and exploiting it. Yet here was one human voluntarily delivering both proof of their knowledge and a potential solution, asking only for a more equitable relationship in return. Kalen's duty to the Empire was clear, but the definition of that duty had suddenly become far less so. Would the Empire be better served by maintaining a failing status quo, or by embracing an uncomfortable but potentially necessary change? Meanwhile, Dr. Reed sat calmly in her quarters, seemingly unperturbed by her isolation or the uncertainty of her fate. She had brought a single physical object with her, a small, worn book of Earth poetry that she read periodically, her expression serene despite her precarious situation. When the security feed of this behavior was brought to Zyler's attention, His suspicion only deepened. No human should be this composed under such circumstances, he muttered to Security Chief Mock. It suggests either psychological conditioning or absolute confidence in some hidden advantage we haven't yet identified. Or perhaps, Mock suggested cautiously, she simply accepts the possibility of death as the necessary risk of her mission. Zyler dismissed this with a contemptuous gesture. Humans fear death pathologically. Their entire culture revolves around denying its inevitability. This calmness is artificial and therefore suspicious. He straightened his uniform. Continue monitoring all systems for any anomalies. The moment Commander Kalen emerges, I want to be notified immediately. When Kalen finally summoned Dr. Reed to his second meeting, the chamber configuration had changed. The transparent barrier had been removed, and only 2 security officers stood at the far end of the room, their weapons holstered though visibly present. Your data is compelling, Kalen stated without preamble as she took her seat across from him. Our preliminary analysis suggests the approach could indeed be viable. Dr. Reed nodded, her expression carefully neutral. I'm grateful for your thorough consideration, Commander. However, he continued, you must understand that I cannot unilaterally alter the blockade parameters. Such a decision would require authorization from the High Command itself. Of course, she acknowledged. I never expected immediate policy change. A first step would be sufficient, perhaps a controlled exchange of scientific delegations to verify the viability of collaboration. Kalen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Communications with High Command are complex at present. There are transmission delays and security protocols that make immediate consultation problematic. This was partially true, but not for the technical reasons implied. The real complexity lay in the political landscape she had so accurately described. Presenting her proposal through official channels would alert the very factions most opposed to any accommodation with humans. The traditionalist houses fighting desperately to conceal their genetic vulnerability. Dr. Reed studied him with perceptive eyes. You're concerned about internal opposition, she said quietly. Understandable. Perhaps then, we might begin with a more modest arrangement, one within your authority as fleet commander. Kalen raised an eye-ridge in silent query. A research vessel, she suggested, granted limited passage through the blockade under strict escort, carrying specialists and equipment to begin preliminary work with Vlork medical personnel of your choosing. No formal treaty, no official recognition, simply a pragmatic field test of our proposed collaboration. And how would you explain such a vessel to your own governments? Kalen asked. Would they not demand fuller concessions or guarantees? Dr. Reed smiled slightly. Commander, Earth's governing bodies have spent 20 years trying to negotiate with the Vlork through official channels, with zero success. They would embrace any progress, however limited. As for my personal role, she shrugged lightly. I have cultivated certain relationships that would facilitate the assembly of such a mission without excessive bureaucratic interference. Kalen considered this carefully. A limited test collaboration would fall within his discretionary authority as fleet commander, particularly if framed as intelligence gathering or strategic assessment. It would allow evaluation of a human's claims without committing the Empire to policy changes that would inflame internal politics. There is another complication, he noted after a moment. Lieutenant Commander Zyler represents a perspective shared by many in our fleet. His opposition to any cooperation with humans is substantial. Yes, she agreed simply. He would certainly attempt to undermine or sabotage any initiative you authorized. Kalen's amber eyes sharpened at her direct acknowledgement of the internal threat. You seem remarkably comfortable discussing the potential mutiny of my second-in-command, Dr. Reed. Forgive me, she replied, not sounding particularly apologetic, but hierarchical military structures face similar challenges across species. When a commanding officer contemplates a significant shift in established policy, resistance from traditionalist elements is virtually inevitable. She leaned forward slightly. If I may offer an observation, Commander? Lieutenant Commander Zyler's hostility toward humans exceeds standard Vlork military caution. His psychological profile suggests personal investment in the current paradigm, perhaps career advancement tied to successful containment operations or familial connections to traditionalist houses most opposed to human integration into galactic affairs. Kalen managed to conceal his surprise at her assessment, which aligned perfectly with his own private concerns. Zyler's family indeed had close ties to three of the noble houses most affected by the genetic degradation, and his rapid promotion had been facilitated by those connections. "You've given this considerable thought," he observed neutrally. 20 years of blockade provides ample time for analysis, she responded with a small, sad smile. "Every officer in your fleet has been studied as thoroughly as possible from our limited vantage point. You yourself, Commander, have shown subtle but consistent patterns suggesting intellectual flexibility unusual among Vlork of your rank, a willingness to adjust tactical approaches based on new information rather than adhering rigidly to established doctrine." She met his gaze directly. "It's why I came to the Iron Sentinel specifically, rather than approaching any other vessel in the blockade. You represented the highest probability of rational consideration. The revelation that humans have been studying individual Vlork command tendencies with such precision was disturbing, yet oddly gratifying to Kalen's analytical mind. It suggested a level of methodical observation he could respect, even from a species the Empire had dismissed as chaotically emotional. "Let us assume," he said carefully, "that I considered authorizing this preliminary exchange. What assurances could you provide against subterfuge? A research vessel could easily conceal espionage operations, or worse." "The same assurances I provided by coming alone in an unarmed vessel," she replied. "Transparency. You would have complete access to all equipment, personnel, and communications. We would operate under your protocols, within parameters you define. The mission succeeds only through earning your trust, Commander. We have no leverage to demand anything more." Kalen stood abruptly, pacing the length of the conference table as he considered the implications. The risk existed, certainly, but remained contained and manageable compared to the potential benefit. If the human genetic techniques proved viable, he would have provided the Empire with a solution to its most critical internal threat. If they failed, or if deception was discovered, the consequences would fall on him alone, and the blockade would continue unchanged. "I will require time to make appropriate arrangements," he said finally, turning back to face her. "Your vessel will remain secured, and you will continue to be housed in the diplomatic quarters under observation." Of course, Dr. Reed agreed easily. "I anticipated a process measured in days, not hours. Your thoroughness is expected and appreciated, Commander." As she was escorted back to her quarters, Kalen remained in the conference room, mentally composing the careful series of orders that would begin this unprecedented shift in approach. He would need to neutralize Zyler's potential interference without creating a record that could later be used against him by the traditionalist faction. He would need to identify medical personnel open to unconventional approaches while maintaining operational security. Most challenging of all, he would need to create a plausible official justification for allowing any human vessel through the blockade, however limited and controlled. Complex, certainly, but the Vlork had not built their empire by shrinking from complexity when necessity demanded adaptation. Lieutenant Commander Zyler had not achieved his position through carelessness or lack of initiative. When the commander had failed to file the expected report on the human intruder, Zyler had activated his own intelligence network within a ship. When security protocols around the humans' quarters were adjusted to a diplomatic rather than prisoner standard, he took note. When Kalen began discreetly consulting with the ship's senior medical officer, alarm bells rang loudly in Zyler's mind. Something was happening, something unauthorized and potentially catastrophic for the blockade's integrity. "He's considering some form of negotiation with the human," Zyler confided to his small circle of loyal officers, gathered in a maintenance section where surveillance was minimal. "This represents a critical threat to our mission and potentially to the Empire itself." The commander has always been methodical in his decisions, objected Technical Officer Vrex cautiously. Perhaps he is simply gathering intelligence through extended interaction. For what purpose? Zyler countered sharply. Our standing orders regarding human contact are explicit. We contain, we monitor, we prevent expansion. There is no provision for negotiation or extended interaction of any kind. He paced the small space, his agitation visible in the twitching of his facial membranes. The human female presents herself as a scientist, but this is obviously a deception. She is undoubtedly a psychological warfare specialist, employing manipulative techniques against the commander. What action do you propose? Asked Security Specialist Krell, a young officer whose family connections to Zyler's clan were well established. The commander's authority is absolute on this vessel. Absolute until it contradicts the strategic directives of High Command, Zyler corrected. I've initiated an emergency communication protocol to Central Authority detailing my concerns. However, transmission time means we cannot wait for a response before acting. He lowered his voice further. We must prepare contingencies to prevent any agreement with the humans from being implemented. If necessary, we may need to assume temporary command control under Emergency Directive 37. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Emergency Directive 37 allowed for removal of a commanding officer if they were deemed compromised by enemy influence. But invoking it without prior authorization was itself a serious violation of chain of command. This is not a decision I make lightly, Zyler assured them, sensing their hesitation. But consider the implications if humans penetrate our blockade in any capacity. The commander's inexplicable fascination with this single human representative threatens 20 years of containment strategy. We must be prepared to act decisively if he orders any reduction in our security posture. While Zyler plotted his contingencies, Supreme Commander Kalen was methodically implementing his own strategy. He had already reassigned key personnel whose loyalty to Zyler might prove problematic, distributing them across different duty shifts to minimize their coordination. The ship's medical officer, Senior Physician Nara, had been briefed on the humans' proposal under the strictest confidentiality protocols. The approach is unorthodox by our standards, Nara admitted, reviewing the data for the third time in Kalen's private laboratory. But the theoretical foundation appears sound. Their understanding of our genetic structure is disturbing in its accuracy. Could it work? Kalen pressed, his focus entirely on the practical question. Nara's elongated fingers tapped thoughtfully against the display. Possibly. Their methodology approaches the problem from an entirely different paradigm than our own research. The use of targeted retroviral vectors to repair specific genetic sequences rather than attempting comprehensive genomic restructuring. It's elegant in its simplicity, and you could evaluate their practical techniques if provided with the appropriate human specialists and equipment. Yes, Nara confirmed. Though such evaluation would require facilities beyond what's available on the flagship. We would need access to the medical research bay on the support vessel Quantum Meridian. Kalen nodded slowly. This aligned with his developing plan. The Quantum Meridian served as the fleet's primary medical and research facility, maintaining a careful distance from potential engagement zones. More importantly, its commander, Sub-Lieutenant Taris, was known for scientific curiosity and had no particular ties to Zyler's faction. Prepare a confidential requisition for the necessary equipment and personnel, Kalen ordered. Classify it under Directive 19, Xenobiological Threat Assessment. Nara's membranes flickered in surprise. That directive relates to analyzing potential biological weapons, Commander. Precisely, Kalen replied. The official documentation will state that we are evaluating human genetic manipulation techniques to assess their potential application as biological agents against Vlork physiology. A deception, Nara observed, not as criticism, but with clinical detachment. A necessary framing, Kalen corrected. One that provides legitimate justification for the research while maintaining operational security. As Nara departed to begin the preparations, Kalen turned his attention to the most delicate aspect of his plan, neutralizing Xyler without creating a ship-wide crisis. Direct confrontation would be problematic, potentially forcing loyal officers to choose sides prematurely. Instead, a more subtle approach was required. In her diplomatic quarters, Dr. Evelyn Reed continued her seemingly endless patience, alternating between reading her poetry book and writing notes in a small journal. The Vlork surveillance systems recorded everything, but her behavior revealed nothing more threatening than occasional stretching exercises to counter the effects of the slightly heightened gravity. When Kalen arrived for another consultation, she received him with the same calm attentiveness that had characterized all their interactions. "Commander," she greeted him, "I trust your evaluations are proceeding." "They are," he confirmed, activating a privacy field that would prevent surveillance within the room. Another exceptional measure that would certainly raise Xyler's suspicions, but unavoidable for what needed to be discussed. "I've authorized preliminary arrangements for a scientific exchange," he stated directly. "A human research vessel with appropriate specialists and equipment will be permitted through the blockade under strict escort to rendezvous with one of our medical ships for controlled evaluation of your proposed techniques." Dr. Reed's composed expression showed only a slight widening of eyes to indicate her surprise at this relatively swift progress. "That is most encouraging, Commander. Thank you for your consideration." "Do not thank me yet," Kalen cautioned. "There are significant challenges to implementation, not least internal resistance from elements within my command structure who would view any cooperation with humans as unacceptable regardless of potential benefit." "Lieutenant Commander Xyler," she acknowledged simply, "and others who share his perspective," Kalen confirmed. "They represent a viewpoint with considerable support in certain sectors of the Empire. Their opposition cannot be dismissed as mere obstinance. It reflects genuine strategic concerns about human unpredictability." Dr. Reed nodded thoughtfully. "Every significant policy shift faces resistance from those invested in the status quo. It's a universal constant across societies." She studied him with penetrating eyes. "May I ask what approach you intend to take with this resistance?" "I had hoped you might offer insights on that very question," Kalen replied with surprising directness. "You've demonstrated remarkable understanding of Vlork psychology and politics. What would you suggest?" Her eyebrows rose slightly at his willingness to seek her counsel on an internal matter. After a moment's consideration, she responded carefully. "In human history, when introducing controversial changes to established policy, the most successful approaches typically involve three elements: incremental implementation, demonstrable early successes, and reassurance mechanisms for those most threatened by the change." She leaned forward slightly. "The incremental approach we've already established, a limited, controlled exchange rather than comprehensive policy revision. Early success would come from demonstrating concrete results from our genetic collaboration. But the reassurance mechanism is perhaps most critical for your internal situation." "Explain," Kalen prompted. "Lieutenant Commander Xyler and those aligned with him need assurance that their core concerns are being addressed, not dismissed," Dr. Reed said. "Their opposition stems from belief that human integration into galactic affairs threatens Vlork security and supremacy. Any implementation plan must visibly maintain Vlork control and advantage throughout the process." She paused, then added more carefully, "For Xyler specifically, there may be need for personal reassurance, recognition that values his perspective while redirecting his energy toward aspects of a new approach where his talents could be productively applied." Kalen's vertical pupils narrowed slightly. "You suggest I attempt to co-opt his opposition rather than override it?" "When possible, yes," she confirmed. "Though I recognize there may be limits to that approach given the intensity of his opposition." Kalen considered her advice with typical Vlork thoroughness, finding it aligned surprisingly well with his own strategic instincts. The human psychological insight was proving as valuable as her scientific knowledge, a realization that simultaneously validated his cautious openness and reinforced the traditional Vlork concerns about human adaptability. "Your assessment has merit," he finally acknowledged. though implementation may prove challenging given existing tensions. Perhaps a demonstration might help, Dr. Reed suggested carefully. A small but concrete example of human-Vlork cooperation providing immediate benefit, something that addresses an existing Vlork concern unrelated to the genetic research. What sort of demonstration do you propose? Kalen asked, his interest piqued despite his caution. I would need more information about current fleet priorities and challenges, she replied. But the principle would be finding an issue where human perspective might offer a novel solution to a problem that has resisted traditional Vlork approaches. Kalen fell silent, contemplating an unexpected possibility. The blockade fleet had indeed been struggling with a persistent technical issue, signal interference in the asteroid belt sector that periodically disrupted communications and sensor arrays. Vlork engineers had applied standard remediation protocols without success for nearly half a cycle. While not critical to operations, the anomaly represented an irritating inefficiency that reflected poorly on technical performance metrics. There may be such an opportunity, he said finally. A technical challenge within our sensor network. Minor, but persistent, resistant to conventional solutions. Dr. Reed nodded, her expression thoughtful but not triumphant. If you're willing to share the parameters, I would be happy to consider whether human approaches might offer an alternative perspective. I will have the relevant data transferred to a secure terminal here, Kalen decided. Consider it a practical test of your cooperative approach, smaller in scale than the genetic research, but potentially useful in demonstrating concept. As he rose to leave, Dr. Reed spoke once more. Commander, there's something else you should know. Her tone was careful, measured. Lieutenant Commander Zeiler has likely already initiated emergency communication with your central command structure. It would be standard protocol for an officer in his position who suspects command compromise. Kalen stiffened slightly, but did not deny her assessment. You seem very confident of his actions. I've studied the psychology and procedural responses of Vlork military hierarchy extensively, she replied simply. In his position, with his temperament and connections, it would be the expected response. You should anticipate potential complications from higher authority within approximately 7 to 10 days, depending on current transmission speeds between your fleet and the central command. The precision of her prediction was disturbing, yet Kalen found himself nodding in acknowledgement. That assessment aligns with my own calculations. Then our timeline for demonstrating initial value is relatively constrained, she noted calmly. All the more reason to address the sensor network issue promptly if you decide to proceed. After Kalen departed, Dr. Reed returned to her chair and picked up her book of poetry once more, her expression betraying nothing of the critical conversation that had just occurred. To any observer monitoring the Nauerzoom surveillance, she appeared exactly as before, an elderly human waiting patiently in alienation, finding solace in literature from her homeworld. But beneath that composed exterior, her mind worked with precise calculation, reviewing each element of the complex strategic game now unfolding aboard the Iron Sentinel. The path remained treacherous, the outcome uncertain, but a door once thought permanently sealed had been cracked open through the power of understanding, patience, and carefully presented truth. The following day cycle brought increased activity throughout the flagship as Kalen's careful preparations began taking more visible form. Medical Officer Nara coordinated with the research vessel Quantum Meridian, requisitioning specialized equipment and personnel under the classified Directive 19 protocol. Security rotations were subtly adjusted, placing officers with minimal ties to Zeiler in key positions during critical periods. Most significantly, a secure data terminal was installed in Dr. Reed's quarters, loaded with the technical specifications of the sensor anomaly affecting the asteroid belt region. The terminal was carefully isolated from all ship systems, preventing any possibility of network infiltration, but it provided the human with her first access to real Vlork technical data. Lieutenant Commander Zeiler observed these developments with growing alarm, his sources throughout the ship reporting patterns that could only indicate preparation for some form of substantive interaction with the human visitor. His emergency communication to Central Command had been dispatched, but the response would take days to arrive given the current stellar positioning. In the meantime, his options for direct intervention remained limited by the chain of command and Kalen's careful management of key personnel. He's systematically mitigating our influence, Zyler noted bitterly to his inner circle. Critical security posts have been reassigned, and the human has been granted some form of data access in her quarters. Perhaps it's misinformation, suggested Technical Officer Rex. A strategic deception to test her responses. That would align with standard protocols, Zyler conceded. But why maintain the diplomatic classification of her quarters? Why consult with Medical Officer Nara, who has no expertise in human psychology or interrogation techniques? No, this pattern suggests genuine engagement with her proposal, whatever it may be. He paced the small maintenance area, frustration evident in his tense posture. We need more specific information about the commander's intentions before we can effectively counter them. Krell, you've been assigned to the diplomatic section security detail. What have you observed? Security Specialist Krell straightened attentively. The human spends most of her time reading or writing. She appears unnaturally calm for her species. The commander has visited 3 times, with privacy fields activated during each consultation. Most recently, a secure data terminal was installed at his direct order. What data was loaded onto this terminal? Zyler demanded. Unknown, sir. The technical team was from Sector 7, outside my direct access. The terminal itself is physically isolated from ship systems. No network connectivity whatsoever. Zyler's facial membranes twitched with irritation. So we know she has access to some form of Lork data, but not its specific nature. This is unacceptable. He turned to Technical Officer Rex. I want surveillance enhanced in the diplomatic section. If standard monitoring is being blocked by privacy fields, find alternative methods. Sound vibration analysis of the chamber walls, thermal mapping, anything that might provide insight into their discussions. Sir, Rex replied hesitantly. Such methods would require authorization from. I'm authorizing it. Zyler cut him off sharply. Under my authority as Chief Security Officer concerned with potential compromise of command. If questioned, you were evaluating potential vulnerabilities in our containment protocols. The gathered officers exchanged uneasy glances, aware that they were moving into increasingly questionable territory regarding chain of command and procedural regulations. Yet none voiced objection, either from loyalty to Zyler or from genuine concern about the unprecedented situation developing aboard the flagship. Proceed carefully, Zyler cautioned, noting their hesitation. This is not about personal ambition or factional advantage. If the commander has been somehow influenced by this human into considering any relaxation of the blockade, the consequences for the Empire could be severe. We are acting to preserve our strategic position and security. The justification rang hollow even to his own inner sense, but Zyler pushed the doubt aside. The Vlork had maintained their galactic position through uncompromising adherence to established strategic doctrine. Deviation invited disaster, regardless of how reasonable it might initially appear. The human represented chaos by her very nature. Even her apparent calm and rationality were simply masks for the fundamental unpredictability that made her species so dangerous. Meanwhile, in her quarters, Dr. Evelyn Reed had immersed herself in the technical data provided by Commander Kalen. The sensor anomaly presented an intriguing puzzle, one that Vlork engineering approaches had failed to resolve due to their inherent methodological constraints. Vlork technology, for all its sophistication, followed highly structured design principles with minimal tolerance for ambiguity or emergent phenomena. Their signal processing algorithms were masterpieces of deterministic efficiency, but relatively inflexible when confronted with chaotic or nonlinear interference patterns. The asteroid belt anomaly appeared to be exactly such a case. A complex, self-reinforcing resonance effect created by the interaction of standard Vlork sensor emissions with the unique mineral composition of a specific asteroid cluster. The resulting interference wasn't random noise, but a structured chaos with its own internal logic, precisely the kind of pattern that human information theory had specialized in addressing from its earliest development. After hours of analysis, Dr. Reed began composing a response using the terminal's basic text input system. She outlined a novel approach using adaptive frequency modulation combined with a neural network pattern recognition algorithm, technologies that existed in the Vlork arsenal but were typically not combined in this particular configuration due to their design philosophy. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity, requiring no new hardware or complex retrofitting, merely a reconfiguration of existing systems with a differently structured algorithmic approach. The true innovation lay not in the components, but in the conceptual framework, a willingness to embrace and adapt to the chaotic pattern rather than attempting to override or eliminate it. As she completed her analysis, she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of demonstration she had hoped for, a concrete, immediately applicable solution that highlighted the value of human cognitive approaches without threatening Vlork technological supremacy in any meaningful way. A small key to potentially open a much larger door. Supreme Commander Kalen reviewed Dr. Reed's proposed solution to the sensor anomaly with carefully concealed surprise. The approach was not merely functional but elegant, incorporating existing Vlork technology in configurations that their engineers had never considered due to their structured design philosophy. Most impressively, the solution could be implemented and tested immediately without special equipment or resources. Forward this to Engineering Chief Merrill. He instructed his personal aide after verifying the proposal contained no potential security risks. Classified as an experimental protocol developed by the Science Division for the asteroid belt interference issue. Not attributing it to the human, sir? The aide asked, then immediately stiffened at his own presumption. Kalen merely raised an eye ridge. Attribution would create unnecessary complications at this stage. The solution should be evaluated on its technical merits alone. Of course, Commander. Immediately, after his aide departed, Kalen considered his next move carefully. The sensor solution, if successful, would provide tangible evidence of potential benefit from human-Vlork cooperation. But it represented only a minor technical advantage compared to the genetic research that constituted the primary proposal. For that more significant collaboration to proceed, he would need to address the Xyler situation decisively before the Lieutenant Commander's emergency communication received response from Central Command. Direct confrontation remained problematic. Removal of a senior officer without explicit cause would require extensive documentation and review, potentially exposing the entire situation to exactly the scrutiny Kalen wished to avoid until initial results could be demonstrated. Instead, a more elegant solution presented itself, one that might simultaneously neutralize Xyler's opposition and advance the collaborative initiative. When he next visited Dr. Reed, Kalen found her reviewing additional technical data on her isolated terminal, her aged fingers moving with surprising dexterity across the unfamiliar Vlork interface. Your proposed solution to the sensor anomaly has been forwarded to our engineering division for implementation, he informed her without preamble. She looked up with a small smile. Thank you, Commander. I believe it will prove effective, though your engineers may wish to fine-tune the frequency modulation parameters for optimal results in your specific systems. If successful, it provides a useful example of complementary methodologies, Kalen acknowledged. However, it remains a minor technical matter compared to the primary proposal. True, she agreed readily. But sometimes small successes build necessary foundations for larger ones. Has there been progress regarding the scientific exchange we discussed? Preliminary arrangements continue, he confirmed. However, internal resistance remains a significant factor. Lieutenant Commander Xyler has likely initiated emergency communication with Central Command regarding the situation. Dr. Reed nodded, unsurprised. As expected, may I ask if you've considered a potential approach to this complication? Kalen studied her for a moment before responding. I believe there may be a solution that addresses both the opposition concerns and advances our objectives. It would, however, require your participation in a somewhat theatrical capacity. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Theatrical? A controlled confrontation, Kalen explained. One that appears to validate Lieutenant Commander Zyler's suspicions while actually redirecting them in a more productive direction. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You wish to stage a scenario where his opposition appears justified, but which ultimately channels toward your intended outcome. Precisely, Kalen confirmed, impressed once again by her quick comprehension. A security incident involving your terminal access, seemingly discovered by Zyler's vigilance, revealing that you have been granted access to technical data regarding our sensor systems, which would appear to confirm his worst suspicions about security breaches. Dr. Reed continued the thought. He would then demand immediate action, which I would acknowledge as appropriate. Kalen finished, ordering a full security review of all interactions with you, temporarily suspending our discussions, and publicly commending his vigilance, while privately continuing preparations through other channels, she surmised. A classic misdirection. It would satisfy his faction temporarily, while buying time for implementation of the preliminary research exchange, Kalen confirmed. When Central Command eventually responds to his communication, they will find that appropriate security measures were already implemented due to his diligence. Dr. Reed considered the proposal thoughtfully. It seems a reasonable approach, though I'm curious about my role once this incident occurs. Would I be returned to isolation? Officially, yes, transferred to a high-security containment area with restricted access, Kalen explained. In practice, this would be the secure medical research section of the ship, where Medical Officer Nara could begin preliminary evaluation of your genetic proposals while maintaining the appearance of enhanced security protocols. Elegant, she acknowledged with genuine appreciation. Though success depends on Lieutenant Commander Zyler accepting this apparent victory rather than pushing for more extreme measures. His psychology suggests he will, Kalen replied confidently. His primary concern is validation of his perspective and reinforcement of his position. A public acknowledgement of his correctness from command will satisfy those needs temporarily. Dr. Reed nodded her agreement. When would you propose to implement this scenario? Immediately, Kalen answered. Lieutenant Commander Zyler has already intensified surveillance of your quarters through unofficial channels. His technical team has been attempting to circumvent the privacy fields during our consultations using secondary detection methods. We will use this unauthorized initiative as the foundation for our scenario. Her eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. You were aware of his enhanced surveillance? Of course, Kalen replied, with what might almost have been amusement in a less disciplined being. Security Chief Mock reports to me first, regardless of Zyler's factional influence. The unauthorized surveillance was permitted to continue specifically to facilitate this eventuality. Dr. Reed's expression shifted to one of respectful reassessment. I see I may have underestimated the complexity of your strategy, Commander. A common error when dealing with the Vlork, he observed dryly. We are significantly less rigid in our tactical thinking than our cultural presentation might suggest. For the first time in their interactions, Dr. Reed allowed herself a genuine laugh, a warm, surprisingly melodious sound that momentarily disconcerted Kalen with its uninhibited expressiveness. Forgive me, Commander, she said, noting his reaction. I was just struck by how that statement might equally apply to humans. Perhaps our species have more in common than either would comfortably admit. Before Kalen could respond to this unsettling observation, his communication device signaled an urgent alert. He checked the display, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. It seems events may be accelerating our timeline, he noted. Engineering has implemented your sensor solution, with immediate and significant improvement in signal clarity. Lieutenant Commander Zyler has just requested an emergency meeting regarding critical security concerns. Dr. Reed's expression became serious once more. Then it appears our theatrical performance may begin sooner than anticipated. Indeed, Kalen agreed. Are you prepared for your role? The elderly human straightened in her chair, her eyes suddenly sharp with focused intensity that belied her age. Commander, I spent 40 years as a xenoanthropologist studying interspecies dynamics before volunteering for this mission. If there's one thing humans excel at, it's adapting to changing scenarios. Kalen acknowledged this with a slight incline of his head. Then let us proceed. When security personnel arrive to discover the unauthorized data access, I suggest you display appropriate human indignation rather than calm acceptance. It will reinforce Zyler's preconceptions about human emotional volatility. A touch of righteous anger and wounded dignity. Dr. Reed agreed with a small, wry smile. I believe I can manage that performance convincingly. The confrontation unfolded precisely as Kalen had orchestrated, though with a theatrical flair that exceeded even his calculated expectations. Lieutenant Commander Zyler, accompanied by a full security detail, burst into the diplomatic quarters with dramatic timing that suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneity. "Commander," he announced with carefully projected alarm upon finding Kalen already present. "We have detected unauthorized data transmission to this terminal. The human has been accessing sensitive technical information." Dr. Reed rose to her feet, her previously calm demeanor replaced by an impressive display of affronted dignity. "This is outrageous. Commander Kalen himself authorized my access to specific technical data as a gesture of scientific exchange." "Scientific exchange?" Zyler seized upon the phrase with predatory eagerness. "So you admit to extracting technological information from our systems?" "I was invited to analyze a specific technical problem that your engineers have failed to resolve," she shot back, her voice rising with apparent emotion. A gesture of good faith to demonstrate potential benefits of cooperation. Kalen allowed the exchange to continue briefly before raising a hand for silence, his expression deliberately grave. "Lieutenant Commander, what precisely have you discovered?" Zyler straightened, visibly pleased at being given center stage. "Sir, our enhanced security monitoring detected data transfer to this terminal containing classified information about our sensor arrays in the asteroid belt sector. The human has been analyzing our technical systems, potentially identifying vulnerabilities." "I see," Kalen replied, his tone measured. "And this enhanced monitoring, was it conducted under standard protocols with proper authorization?" A momentary flicker of uncertainty crossed Zyler's features before he recovered. "Sir, as Chief Security Officer, I authorized expanded surveillance due to concerns about command compromise. The results vindicate that decision." "Indeed," Kalen acknowledged, turning to Dr. Reed with perfect cold disapproval. "It appears, Dr. Reed, that your access to our technical systems presents a security concern regardless of its stated purpose." She drew herself up indignantly. "Commander, I have done exactly what was requested of me. Analyzed your sensor anomaly and provided a workable solution. If that constitutes a security breach, then your invitation was disingenuous from the start. The security implications must be evaluated regardless of intentions," Kalen replied impassively. "Lieutenant Commander Zyler, your vigilance is noted and commended. The human will be transferred immediately to high-security containment for comprehensive assessment of this breach." Zyler's expression shifted to one of wary satisfaction, pleased at the vindication, but clearly suspicious of Kalen's ready agreement. "Sir, I recommend immediate termination of all interaction with the human and destruction of any data she has accessed or produced." "That would be premature," Kalen countered smoothly. "If she has identified vulnerabilities in our systems, we must first determine their extent and implement countermeasures. Medical Officer Nara will conduct a full cognitive assessment under maximum security protocols." "Medical Officer Nara?" Zyler questioned sharply. "Sir, this is a security matter, not a medical one." "It is both," Kalen replied with a perfect note of stern authority. "We must determine whether this represents isolated opportunism or a coordinated human intelligence operation with broader implications. The human psychological evaluation is essential to that assessment." Before Zyler could object further, Kalen activated his command communication channel. "Security, escort the human to Containment Section 5. Maximum protocols. Medical Officer Nara to oversee all interaction. Lieutenant Commander Zyler's security team is authorized to conduct complete analysis of all data accessed and generated during this breach. He turned back to Zyler with an expression of grim determination. You were right to be suspicious, Lieutenant Commander. Prepare a full report on this incident for Central Command, including your recommendation for enhanced security measures throughout the fleet. I will append my own assessment and commendation of your initiative. The calculated praise achieved its intended effect. Zyler straightened with pride, his suspicion partially allayed by this public validation. Thank you, Commander. I will begin immediately. As Dr. Reed was led away by the security team, maintaining her indignant protests with impressive consistency, Kalen allowed himself a final authoritative statement for Zyler's benefit. This incident demonstrates the fundamental untrustworthiness of humans, regardless of their apparent cooperation. We will extract whatever useful information this one possesses, then determine an appropriate final disposition. The theatrical performance concluded with Zyler's departure to prepare his triumphant report to Central Command, leaving Kalen apparently returned to orthodox Vlork containment policy. In reality, the staged incident had accomplished exactly what Kalen intended, redirecting Zyler's opposition into a channel that actually facilitated the very collaboration he sought to prevent. Containment Section 5, despite its ominous designation, was adjacent to the ship's primary medical research facilities, where Medical Officer Nara could begin preliminary evaluation of the human genetic techniques under the guise of psychological assessment. Zyler's security team, focused on analyzing the sensor data, would soon discover the solution's effectiveness, creating a contradictory narrative where human input produced demonstrable benefits despite the species' supposed untrustworthiness. Most importantly, when Central Command eventually responded to Zyler's emergency communication, they would find that appropriate security measures had already been implemented, the situation contained, and preliminary benefits already demonstrated, all without any formal change to the blockade policy that would require higher authorization. It was, by Vlork standards, an elegant solution to a complex problem of competing strategic priorities and internal politics. What Kalen would not have admitted, even to himself, was how much the approach reflected the very human adaptability and unconventional thinking that the Empire ostensibly feared. 3 days later, the sensor array reconfiguration had been fully implemented throughout the asteroid belt sector, resolving the persistent interference issue that had plagued Vlork operations for nearly half a cycle. The solution's effectiveness was undeniable, improving signal clarity by 47% and reducing maintenance requirements by 32%. In Containment Section 5, Dr. Evelyn Reed continued her cognitive assessment under Medical Officer Nara's supervision. The austere detention cell had been subtly transformed into a functional research space, with secure terminals loaded with anonymized genetic data from the ruling caste bloodlines. To maintain the appearance of interrogation for surveillance purposes, their technical discussions were interspersed with seemingly probing questions about human intentions and capabilities. The retroviral technique you propose would require significant modification to account for the unique protein folding characteristics of Vlork cellular structures, Nara observed during one such session, ostensibly evaluating Dr. Reed's scientific knowledge for hidden threats. Yes, Reed agreed, maintaining her role as reluctant informant. The third-phase binding proteins would need reconfiguration using a synthetic amino acid sequence as an intermediary carrier. Human genetic research developed similar approaches for treating our own radiation-induced mutations following the orbital wars. Their scientific exchange continued productively under this thin veneer of interrogation, with Nara growing increasingly convinced of the fundamental viability of the human approach. The Vlork physician, while maintaining appropriate professional distance, found herself intellectually stimulated by the cross-species collaboration in a way she had not experienced in standard Vlork research circles, where methodological orthodoxy often constrained innovation. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Zyler had received preliminary acknowledgement of his emergency communication to Central Command, with a full response expected within 2 more days. The acknowledgement contained no specific directives, merely confirmation of receipt and processing, standard procedure that nevertheless reinforced his confidence that his actions would ultimately be vindicated by higher authority. What he failed to recognize was the subtle shift in operational dynamics occurring throughout the flagship. The sensor array success had created a quiet but significant ripple of interest among the scientific and technical personnel who had begun discussing the implementation details with professional curiosity. The official narrative maintained that the solution had been developed by the science division through novel analysis methods, but rumors inevitably circulated regarding the humans' potential involvement. Furthermore, preparations for the limited research exchange continued discreetly through channels outside Zyler's direct oversight. The medical vessel Quantum Meridian had adjusted its position within the blockade formation, ostensibly for routine maintenance, but actually positioning itself optimally for potential rendezvous with an authorized human research vessel. Key personnel had been briefed under security protocols that compartmentalized information, preventing any individual except Kalen from seeing the complete operational picture. On the 6th day following the security incident, Supreme Commander Kalen received 2 critical communications almost simultaneously. The first, from Engineering Chief Merrill, reported that implementing the sensor solution fleet-wide would improve overall operational efficiency by an estimated 23%, a significant enhancement that would reflect favorably on Kalen's command record regardless of its source. The second communication came directly from Central Command, responding to Zyler's emergency report. Kalen reviewed it privately in his quarters, his expression remaining characteristically impassive despite its contents potentially determining the success or failure of his careful strategy. The response was, in typical Vlork fashion, methodically structured and precise. It acknowledged the potential security concern represented by human access to technical data, commended the vigilance in identifying and containing the situation, and formally approved the continued assessment of a human under maximum security protocols to extract any potentially valuable intelligence. Most significantly, it contained a classified addendum addressed only to Kalen, originating from the Science Directorate rather than military command. Recent analysis indicates genetic degradation affecting noble lineages has accelerated beyond previous projections. Traditional remediation approaches show diminishing efficacy. Science Directorate authorizes discrete evaluation of alternative methodologies, including limited controlled access to non-standard research if potential benefits justify security considerations. Maximum containment protocols must be maintained. No formal policy changes regarding human containment authorized at this time. Report findings directly to Science Directorate Priority Classification. Kalen read the addendum twice, recognizing both the extraordinary latitude it provided and the careful bureaucratic language that maintained deniability for all involved. The Science Directorate, likely influenced by noble families most affected by the genetic crisis, had effectively authorized exactly what Kalen had already initiated without explicitly acknowledging the human source or formally altering the blockade policy. It was in essence permission to proceed with the collaboration while maintaining the official posture of uncompromising containment, a perfect example of Vlork pragmatism operating behind a facade of ideological consistency. Kalen composed his response with equally careful language, confirming implementation.